everyone, my name is Brian Runk. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm here with other folks from University of Minnesota, and we're very excited to be participating in the ABM webinar. A bit of background on the series. Some of the folks at UMN were asking about this. So this webinar series grew out of a conversation that happened at the ABM conference in San Diego in, I believe that was April. And there was a realization that there's a need within the community, particularly among graduate students, to engage more deeply across institutions and engage more frequently with kind of the leading scholars in the field, because everyone's distributed globally. And so this is one of the ideas that came out of how to address it. So it's my distinct honor to introduce David O'Sullivan today. I think those of you who have read his work know that he has a particularly unique ability to illuminate kind of theoretical connections with computer simulation, and particularly his ability to bring in complexity theory, allow that to speak to human geography, and then allow human geography to speak back to complexity theory. I know that there's a fan club here at the University of Minnesota. You can't see us, David, but we're wearing T-shirts with your face on it, and I'm sure that that's happening other places too. Broadly, David is a human geographer, and he, as you're going to see today in his talk, is really interested in mixed methods geography, and I'd say very deep mixing. This isn't a little shallow bit of a few qualitative interviews, but going deep into the humanities with narrative. Some of the common threads that are fundamental concepts in spatial analysis, modeling and visualization, and the implications of geospatial technologies, computation, and especially the complexity sciences are all interests of his. And it all gets deep into this question of how we should represent the world in computers and in geography. So at the most general level, he explores relationships between spatial structures and properties. So I give a plug for his book that was published about 4 years ago, Spatial Simulation, Exploring Pattern and Process, where he, in my opinion, does a really wonderful job of systematically laying out these ideas. And so with that, I'll pass it over to David, and we're very excited to have you here today, and we'll do our digital clap for you.
Well, thank you, Brian. Can everyone hear me? It's hard. It's a little. I've done a few of these in the past, and it's a little hard sometimes to know if you're being heard. Anyway, I guess I will press on. And so, first of all, thank you very much, Brian, for that very flattering introduction. I sometimes wonder if I can really deliver on all of that kind of promise. I certainly aim to deliver on the promise of some of what you said. I'm not sure. We'll have to see what people think after I've given this talk. Ahead of the talk, I should make one health warning. Health warning is not the word I'm looking for. Health warning will do. But this is actually, I have been so busy this semester, I haven't found time to put together a new talk, and this is a rehash of a talk I gave at the AAG 2 or 3 years ago. The paper on which it is based is still making its way through the peer review process. And actually, some aspects of that process are maybe something that would be interesting to talk about after some of the ways in which some of the challenges to taking this kind of approach to agent-based modeling and the way that that's kind of received in the field are perhaps interesting. Anyway, I'll start from there. I think I've maybe got 15, maybe 20 minutes of material. And then I'm very happy to spend time discussing and questions after. Okay? Right. So this is actually work with George Perry, who was co-author. Where's that book on? The book is somewhere here. Somewhere, there it is. There it is. Hunt for the book. George was co-author. George is a plant ecologist who's still at the University of Auckland. We were colleagues there for several years before I moved to Berkeley 3 or 4 years ago. So, and he did much of the more analytical, quantitative work that is in this talk. So what there's a kind of a big story here in terms of the research topic, the research questions that underpin this work. There's a model at the center of it, an agent-based model, which those of you who have read or looked at this book will be somewhat familiar with, probably. And really then the kind of core of this talk is this issue, this question of how can we approach models as devices that generate narratives or stories, and what kinds of methods might we use to do that? And then I have some very tentative conclusions coming out of all of that. So the big story first. This is one version of the story. The model is not a model of this particular context, but this is a kind of a cool image that I wanted to include. What this is an image of is the birds on the ground are moa, and the moa are no more in New Zealand. They are the largest flightless birds, pretty akin to dinosaurs that were present in New Zealand before humans arrived. In this picture, they're being attacked by an eagle, which no longer exists either, the Haast's eagle, which preyed on moa, astonishingly. And these were vast birds with much bigger eagles than anything that is still around. Apparently they used to just sort of put their wings back and fall out of the sky, and there's fossil evidence of moa with kind of talon marks in the bones. So this is an artist's impression of that world. The moa are no more. This is a ridiculous rhyme that is taken a little while to appear. There it is. No moa, you know, Aotearoa, can't get them, they've ate them. People ate them. So the eagles preyed on them, but it was people that did for them. They're gone and they're moa. So that's the context. It's this question of, just to give you a size of the sense of the scale of these animals, this is a scientist standing next to a skeleton. They were huge, really giant megafauna. And this is work that George Perry has been involved in with a bunch of other in New Zealand. Up here in the top image, we have estimates of when humans first arrived in New Zealand. These estimates are kind of based on the archaeological record. Somewhere probably in the 13th century is the best estimate. And then we have estimates of the extinction of moa, which took not very long. Humans are pretty dangerous animals when it comes right down to it. The moa disappeared within a couple of hundred years of human arrival. And it's in this context that the model that I'm going to talk about is kind of constructed. Another picture of the ways in which humans impacted the New Zealand lands. And New Zealand's actually pretty interesting. We tend to think of it as this kind of unspoiled place, but what it actually is evidence of how incredibly rapidly humans alter ecosystems. These are maps of the forest cover of New Zealand before human arrival in somewhere before the 13th century. By the 19th century, before European arrival, and into the present. So the green is the forest cover, and we can see that what was essentially almost entirely forest covered is now has very sparse forest cover, apart from the western side of the South Island. So this is the kind of context. It's human settlement of islands in the broadly conceived in the Pacific, and we're kind of interested in exploring questions of how does this occur, how contingent is it on the particular events on particular islands, is it something that's inevitable, what are the kind of time frames, what are the kind of histories that might, what are the difference of histories that might emerge in different particular settings. And we wanted to use agent-based modeling and simulation modeling more broadly to explore these questions. Okay, so that's the setting. I'm now going to say a few words about our model. As I've mentioned, if you have read this book or used this book or used the models that are presented in this book, Chapter 8 goes into some detail about this model. We've actually, since this time, simplified it a little bit. This image is a pretty, if anybody's used NetLogo, this is a pretty bewildering array of parameters to be set here. But essentially we have an island setting. The green areas are kind of vegetation and what we consider to be low value resources there for exploitation by human settlers. The gray areas are, if you like, habitat areas where higher value resources such as MOA, or it might be in other islands, in other contexts, different other kinds of megafauna, large animals of some kind that provide a potentially much richer, higher energy diet, but which have to be hunted. And the idea of this model is that we initialize this island, which is going to have, we can parameterize it to have different amounts of high value resource available. You can, if you look through on the left-hand side here, there are parameters that relate to the structure, the spatial structure of the island. And then the parameters on the right-hand side relate to like the demography of the hunter-gatherer groups that are arriving on the island, how large those groups can be before they split into separate groups, what are the reproductive rates of the humans, what is the maximum birth rate of humans. And then we also have parameters that relate to the demography of the low and high value resources, the low value resources being the vegetation, broadly speaking the vegetation, high value resources being the animals, the MOA or whatever other animals it might be in a particular context. And then we also have parameters that relate to the hunting process. How many, effectively, how effective are the humans at killing the animals, and what size of hunt party do they assemble, and how far will they range from their current home base before they go hunting, and so on. So this is the kind of the model, and I don't know how well this will work. This gives you a sense of the workings of it. We kind of initialize the landscape structure, we initialize the resources that are part of that landscape structure, then we initialize groups, and then we have a kind of a process that's iterated here, where we first of all check if there are any groups still on the island, and if they're not, the model stops. If there are, then the various hunter-gatherer groups that are on the island assess their situation. How well are they doing? Do they need to go hunting? How many hunts should they engage in a particular month? The time interval in the model is a month, roughly speaking, a month. 12 ticks in the model to a year. And then having made decisions about whether they're going to go hunting or not, they engage in hunting. And they also forage locally. We update the map, and we update at the end of the year, the human groups and also the resources replenish. They reproduce, population grows, and so on. There's also, on the right-hand side here, there's a flow chart that gives you some of the details of how the hunting proceeds. It's probably a bit too much detail to get into here, but essentially they figure out how many hunts they're going to be. They kind of go on a semi-random walk process until they encounter kind of hunting grounds, and once they've identified hunting grounds, they then exploit the hunting grounds and return back to base with whatever they manage to kill. It's quite a brutal world, this model. Okay, so that's the gist of the model. I can run a video here. I'm really not sure how well this will show up on this system. I see that it's running. Doesn't really matter in terms of the detail, but essentially there's a little orange blob that's moving around here. That is the home base of the group, and then they're exploiting different of these high-value resource areas. At some point, if the population's doing particularly well, the group might split into two separate groups who then begin to more rapidly exploit the island because there are two home bases. Just watching this, I can't remember if it does that. So at some point, if the population of the group goes beyond that max group size, the group splits and kind of carves the island up into two different territories. And at that point, exploitation will tend to proceed a lot more rapidly because there are now two groups exploiting different parts of the island. But then there are other model runs where they don't do so well. Maybe they don't find the high-value resource quickly enough and the population doesn't do so well and they decide it's not such a great island after all, and they leave. This runs for quite a while, so it's probably not particularly educational to watch it to completion. So I'll stop that. You can see here it says on the right-hand side there are about 30 or so model parameters. There are quite a large number of potential measures of the outcomes in terms of how successful the group is at exploiting the island resources, what the population is over time. It's quite difficult to analyze all of this. And really, the frame with which we wanted to approach this was something that I kind of talked about in much earlier papers, was to kind of say, well, here we have this model, it's got all this detail, and yet the typical approach to analyzing such models is to just use these summary statistics. There's a paper which I think I sent Brian beforehand that James Millington is the lead author on, where he describes this approach to analyzing models as the kind of pile of numbers approach. And that's kind of, in a sense, that's the traditional way that we look at these things. We go to all this trouble of making this really detailed model with all these details, all these specific details of what hunter-gatherer, in this case, the hunter-gatherer group is getting up to month by month, all these different actions that they're engaged in. And there's potentially quite a lot of that's quite rich in terms of all the events that are unfolding and all of the detail that we're going to all this trouble to model. And yet what we tend to do is to kind of boil it down to a bunch of summary statistics. And I think one of our kind of key claims here is that why put all that detail into the model if we're not going to make use of it when we report the results from it? So what we thought we would try to do was to use those output measures, the 15 or so things that we're measuring in terms of human population, number of hunts, the amount of high-value resource taken versus low-value resource taken, etc., etc. Rather than using them and just compiling these summary statistics, to try to use them in combination with various data mining methods to identify what we're calling narrative arcs. Now, that's not a well-defined term, but broadly speaking, the idea is that probably when we run this model, it produces a particular history. And if we run it thousands of times, it produces lots of different histories. But there are presumably some kind of common sense to those different histories. And we're kind of suggesting that it's maybe more instructive, rather than focusing on kind of end outcomes, how long did the population survive, or how long did it take to completely despoil the island, We're more interested in what was the kind of sequence of events, and can we identify time series that are kind of characteristic, and are there different groups of those? So we kind of deploy a series of data mining methods to find the model parameters that are most relevant to producing these different narrative arcs. Now, this is where I have to kind of put my hand up and say that although I kind of understand these methods in general, I don't have a complete grasp on them in detail. And this is also an aspect of the paper that has changed in the revisions that we've been doing for publication. So we've actually simplified quite a lot of this because it was a problem in terms of communicating what we were trying to do. So I'll very quickly go through this. But in essence, what we've done is to try to identify broad categories of history. And here you can see, broadly speaking, there are successful colonizations of the island and there are failed colonizations of the island. And they have we can relate those to the different parameter settings that we use to configure the model. And this is true whether we look at a whole bunch of different islands, or if we look at the same island multiple times. See, broadly speaking, there are successful colonizations where the human population grows to quite high levels, and exploitation of resources proceeds to its fullest extent. Now, success and failure are obviously framed in terms of the human population, in this language. Ecologically, we might think of success actually being a catastrophe, but that's a different question for a different talk. We apply. This is these colors here show different clusterings that we've been able to produce of the different island histories, expressed with respect to different parameters that we're measuring. The number of ticks being the length of the duration of the settlement in years, model years, the size of the island, the initial settler group population, the average population over time, the mean number of high value resources killed, the time at which the kill maxed out in terms of years since initial settlement, and so on. And you can see that there is some coherence to this clustering. We can also summarize some of the various variables in relation to these clusters. And broadly speaking, in this particular analysis, we identify 6 kind of classes of time series. We've not given them very evocative names. These are very literal kind of names. Something that's missing here is the cases where the initial settlement is just in a very bad location, and the settlers decide that the island is no use at all and leave immediately. But another bad outcome for the settlers is that they just don't do very well over an extended period of several years, and they give up islands. The population falls. These are populations. I can't remember exactly what these lines are. Let me just quickly see. Yeah, they show up. So the black line is population. The red line is kill of the high value resource. The blue lines, how many are actually assumed, and the green line is the local exploitation of the low value resource. So probably the key one here is the black line for population. And then the red and the blue lines give you an indication of how well the hunting is going. And you can see that when the hunting goes badly, they basically just leave. The L here is an indication of the group left, leaving the island. Then we have more successful settlement over a medium term of several decades. But you can see here that the population of the human settler group never really takes off. They're kind of eking out an existence, but just barely. This is their population. It never really never takes off. Then we have a higher exploitation regime over several decades into the kind of century. These are just typical stories, not summary stories. Then we have shorter term medium exploitation, and then we have very short intense exploitation. You can see here population of the human group actually took off pretty rapidly, and then because it took off rapidly, kind of wiped out the hunting grounds and they then left. So there are these kind of different stories. Now, if we were better storytellers, we could probably write sort of pen portraits of each of these and sort of describe each of them in a little bit more detail. And that, I think, would be going the next step of connecting this highly data-intensive analysis to maybe a more interpretive analysis that perhaps someone in archaeology or anthropology or ecology might be able to kind of make some sense of. So instead of us speaking this language of statistics, we'd be speaking in the same language that other researchers in this area are interested in. So I'll not say very much about this slide, but in essence, because of the data mining methods we were using, in case random forests, I believe, we're able to kind of relate how dependent each of those different characteristic narrative arcs is on the different input variables, and so we're then able to maybe speculate or talk in a kind of more theoretical way about what are the conditions in place in particular islands, in particular contexts, that are most likely or more or less likely to lead to different outcomes over time. Okay, so now reflecting on some of that and kind of attempting to come to some conclusions, we're all, or at least many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with this, the butterfly effect. I think in some ways, and this is really what we're attempting to get at with approaching the analysis in this way, is that we're trying to get back to recognizing the web, which is something we take from complexity science and to an extent from chaos theory, the degree to which the particular outcomes in particular cases are highly contingent on very local and particular effects. What we find in doing this work is that almost any outcome is any story, any narrative seems to be possible on any island. So a relatively low resource island can still lead to extended exploitation over a long period of time, or maybe with a little bit higher likelihood, it leads to a very short-term exploitation and then the humans leave and disappointed in the island. But essentially any of these six stories can unfold on pretty much any island. And how we read that, how we interpret that is that these very particular local effects of a particular group finding the high-value resources at a particular moment, setting up camp that happens to be close to such high resources, whether or not that happens is something that's not predictable per se, and therefore it's effectively contingent. That means that in a broad sense, the environment is only very weakly determining of the outcomes. A resource-rich island can produce protracted, successful settlement, perhaps not settlement that leads to very large human populations, but the settlement and hence, civilization of some kind and archaeological remnants, etc., might still be found, even if the island wasn't really a particularly promising location. On the other hand, not only is the environment weakly determining of the outcome, but the human behavior is relatively weakly determining. We can't assume that an understanding of the cultural aspects of what's going to give us the full picture either. That's not a very satisfactory finding, perhaps. It kind of is a finding of, anything can happen. although what is interesting about it is I think it puts the onus back on the the more interpretive kinds of science, the more interpretive kinds of study that might be done in this context. It kind of opens that up. It sort of says, actually, based on what we've found and what we've seen, the field is open for really explaining what's going on here. The archaeology and the anthropology is really important. It actually matters. Okay, so some thoughts arising, perhaps kind of a little ironically or contradictorily. This attempt at a qualitative approach is highly dependent on very data-intensive analytical methods, which is, I'm just going to put that out there. I don't really know what to make of that. It's kind of an interesting irony. I think this kind of approach is perhaps most relevant for cases that are empirically inaccessible. So here we're talking about, remote islands in the Pacific, broadly speaking, where there might be pretty sparse archaeological records that all happened hundreds of years ago. So what we're really trying to do is kind of reconstruct stories of what might have occurred that can then inform other kinds of interpretive attempts to explore what happened. So maybe this isn't an approach that's especially relevant to building agent-based models that might uncover change in the present. I don't know. Maybe that's something we can talk about. So yeah, these kind of empirically inaccessible cases, the distant past, or perhaps the medium and far future. This kind of more qualitative approach to analyzing and exploring and understanding agent-based models, maybe it's most relevant for those more speculative uses of the tools. And with that, I'm going to stop and open the floor to questions, which I have time. I can go on for quite a while if you want to. So thank you, and I'm interested to discuss.
Thank you so much, David. Just to order how we're going to do the questions, just please say your name and institution, and we'll have a conversation.
Hi, this is Sarah for Buffalo.
Oh, hi, Sarah. I didn't know there were any faculty in the room. Ah.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm here. I appreciated your talk, and I'm curious about, so I see the value of analyzing the parameter space of the model outputs to develop the clusters and get a sense of the potential range of stories. But I'm wondering, for a particular realization of the model based on, one particular setting, maybe one that you picked after the complete analysis, would it be useful to drill down not just into the time series, but the sequence of events that transpired in the model by threading? There are ways of recording, what's happening at different points in the model that are key to the outcomes that you're seeing. Is that something that you've looked into or thought about how that could help articulate the narrative?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you. I think there is one of the. I don't know if this was among the readings that I suggested to Brian ahead of this session, but that's something that in a paper Millington, James Millington was the lead author. That's something we kind of tried to do in a very simple model there of what was it? Synchrony in egg laying by birds. And the broader point of this kind of strand of my work and my work with others, such as George and James, is exactly what you're getting at, I think. That here we are building these complicated models with thousands of elements and all these moving parts, and multiple agents and institutions and actors and dozens of parameters. And then what do? We kind of come up with 3 summary statistics and discuss them in those very, we kind of build all that detail and then we kind of throw it all away. And one of the things I take from complexity theory and that approach to the world is that the details matter and that the details can kind of scale up and lead to unexpected outcomes. And so absolutely, I mean, in this particular case, we sort of showed 6 time series, and you can get some sense of the evolution of those particular instantiations of the model from those time series. But a much more detailed recounting of events is available, because if you set your model up right properly, you can put in the random seed and replay exactly that model. And I think at that point, then kind of it becomes potentially really interesting and really instructive to figure out, what were the key moments in this particular history where, a particular thing occurred that meant that this settlement went on long-lived and successful, or conversely, if that hadn't occurred, the population might have fallen and they'd have given up and left the island in disappointment. So absolutely, I mean, I think that's the other part of this, is trying to allow in to the way in which we talk about models and talk about the results and our understandings from models, allow in that kind of level of detail. I mean, I think there is that kind of, I mean, I think we actually do this as model builders all the time. We build models and we kind of watch them and we kind of go, oh, this guy's, what are they going to do now? We actually are kind of telling ourselves the stories as we kind of watch them during the model development process.
Right.
We don't really have a well-developed way of presenting that in our results. And that seems like a strange kind of disconnect to me.
Well, it seems, I mean, I'm not as familiar with how one would go about doing it in NetLogo. I know that in AnyLogic, there have been special tools developed particularly for that purpose, but it's not, even though we can see and interpret as it's happening, it's hard to systematically export that information, I think, without some tailoring of the tools to do it. But I guess my question is, would it be worthwhile? And you seem to agree with that. I don't, as a substitute, but maybe complementary to other approaches, once you have a sense of what interesting stories there are to explain.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways this is an extension, a kind of deeper dive in some ways into, people talk about scenario development in the modeling context, particularly when you kind of start to deal with policy people. And this is a sort of a slightly, an attempt to think about, are there ways of going even deeper in that, going a little bit further in that direction, where instead of just having these broad clusters of outcomes, we actually look in detail at particular stories that our model enables us to tell. Now, I don't know that we've not gotten very far in terms of how you might operationalize that. I think the random facts technique that underpins the results in this particular presentation might provide ways of getting at that, because it enables you to kind of link particular input parameters to associate them with particular arcs. And that might be an initial clue as to what are key events. But unfortunately, I think that the truth of it is that going down this path probably involves looking a lot, much more closely at the specifics of particular model runs, and that's probably unavoidably time consuming.
Fair enough.
Anyone else?
So David, this is Brian Rump, University of Minnesota. One question I had, as you know, there's this huge, literature and body and genre studies, and I couldn't help but, think of that when you're using PCA to create these clusters. Have you interacted with anyone kind of in the literary community or who does genre work and gotten their thoughts on that?
The short answer is no. I am really fascinated by. I've kind of made various more or less abortive attempts to kind of engage with, narrative theory and so on, and I feel like there's a lot of richness that might be unlocked there. But all of this is very definitely at the kind of edges of very different philosophies for how to understand the world. That kind of the old two cultures thing, the arts and the sciences, the sciences and the humanities, how do we, and I'm not sure quite how you bridge that gap. I think there's a lot of really interesting, I think we scratched the surface of it a little bit with this work, but I'm not sure, we haven't been able to get deeply into that, and it's that's partly discipline, limits of discipline. I think there's, one sees really interesting examples, or not examples, that's the wrong word. There are really interesting developments in AI and machine learning about training machines to write baseball stories. I don't know if you've ever seen that work. There's a company, I think at Northwestern, what do they call themselves? Narrative Science, I think is their name. And they've developed tools that enable a computer to take baseball scores. So the data, there's this very low, you get the score at the end of each of the 9 innings, and there's little summary symbol. I don't know baseball well enough to explain this exactly, but they can construct out of those sort of 18 numbers, as it were, the 9 innings, the 9 scores, convincing stories, 200-word stories about all of the games from the night before. The sad side of this, if you're married to a journalist, is that this is putting journalists out of work. But the interesting side to it, from my perspective, is that here is an example of automatically generating stories, or maybe pen portraits would be a better description in this context, out of a set of numbers. Now, the reason that's possible with baseball scores is that baseball is this very confined, very particular world with very distinct limits on what can occur. There's only a very limited palette of options. There's only a very limited language for describing what unfolded. Obviously, when we start to think about models of land use change or archaeological models of the rise and fall of civilizations, etc., that expands the range a lot. I think one thing, just to something that, another area that I've started to think about, and in some ways return to, driven by very similar urges here, is to think in terms of games as simulations, by which I mean, board games or games with people around a table. And there's some really interest, because there, rather than kind of boxing all of the mechanics into a simulation and then kind of creating for ourselves this problem of interpreting the black box, because you're working directly with people, the storytelling is kind of maybe a bit closer to the surface. Does that answer the question?
It's fascinating. We use geodesign systems in a lot of our work to kind of extract narratives from people and help them co-construct narratives, with various water quality models or other ecosystem service models. And I've thought about, how is it that, because right now it's all just spatial. And so the idea is that the hope is that it's increasing people's, the complexity of their constructions of space is kind of what we think is happening and the data says is happening. But the time aspect is really critical. And, and so I've thought a lot about how to, do the same thing with time. And it doesn't lend itself as easily to visualization and co-construction in the same kind of way that we have with these big touchscreens. And what you're describing is really interesting to me, because if you could automate some of that story building process, it's a way to kind of transport people into these worlds, or if they're actually engaging in a game within them. I find that to be really fascinating. I could see that being very powerful for people trying to make decisions.
Right. I think one of the things that's actually come out of, there's a version of this work under review at, I think it's something like the Journal of Archaeological Science. I can't remember exactly George is the lead author and corresponding author, so he's a little bit on top of the details. But one of the things that's come out of that process was, I think quite rightly, the reviewers commented that we were using clustering techniques, as you've seen in this presentation, that don't actually take time very seriously. And what we were pushed towards, which I think is really interesting, is a set of techniques called dynamic time warping, which are kind of a set of clustering methods that are specific to the clustering of time series. And so if you've got a set of time series for a model, are kind of potentially really useful in that context. Very computationally intensive, unfortunately. But essentially, as I understand it, dynamic time warping takes time and kind of squishes them and stretches them to see how to maximize the match between two different time series. And so, actually, in a way, it almost directly relates to this notion of the R. Excuse me. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, it's on.
Hi, this is Nate from MSU, and can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you for the talk, by the way. I think it's really interesting to look at the details of the dynamics of the system and as it's unfolding, rather than looking at the beginning and the end and trying to infer something from that. On that note, I'm curious, were there any tools, like mathematical tools, that you wished you would have had in this process, or did you find the data mining techniques to be adequate for what you were doing?
Well, I guess in what I just said about the dynamic time warping, that to me looks looks a really promising approach, which we, in this version of the paper that I've just presented, we didn't use, but which in review we've been kind of encouraged to look into. Because as I say, it's actually specifically tailored to this question of finding similarities in time series, and it kind of, as I say, it sort of takes seriously sequence. You know, it's not. You know, I think one of the problems with the analysis that's in this version is that the clustering was done on, you know, all of the was done on kind of averages and standard deviations and those kinds of summaries of time series, whereas dynamic time warping takes seriously the fact that what happened at time x before time x plus 1 and after time x minus 1. So that's kind of a really, I think that looks like quite a fruitful direction. I think the problem I have with data mining as a general category, I don't know if anybody's seen the XKCD cartoon about this, but if you haven't, I recommend it. XKCD data mining, Google it. Is the kind of, when we start to deal with these giant piles of numbers, and you know, even a very simple model like this is generating tens of thousands of numbers every time you run it, we're kind of in danger of kind of being caught up in this very, you know, interpretive loop where we see what we expect to see, and then what we expect to see confirms what we thought we would see. You know, we get into this kind of slightly problematic. I mean, I think there's some kind of question of it's the science, to what degree we're doing science when we get into that kind of interpretive loop, and what degree we're doing something else. I'm not sure. Well, I think what is helpful, and we dropped it for the revised version of this because it was causing problems with one of the reviewers just had never encountered the technique, and he was unhappy that it was, you know, you were going to have to write a extended explanation of the technique, and that was going to get in the way of things. But the random forests stuff, which is kind of a version of regression trees, we find to be really interesting. And if you're interested in that, it's in chapter 8 of the book. We do some work with them, and we don't say much about how they work exactly, but what we get from those methods is outputs which tell you the degree to which membership of different clusters in a vacation is a function of the presence or absence of different input parameters. And that kind of gives you a bit of a nudge in the direction of explanation. I don't want to, no, explanation is too strong a term, but it gives you a nudge in the direction of justifiable interpretation, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so I think that I'm very wary of sort of unsupervised classification techniques that just spit out clusters, and then you're kind of on your own interpreting them. Because I think when that happens, you're kind of you're into this kind of troubling space where you know, whatever prior expectations you brought to the process, you're totally just confirming them. Mm-hmm. So techniques that provide you with some kind of diagnostic and that to some degree enable you to relate outputs to inputs seem to me the most valuable in this space.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, and I really appreciate, David, that you're able to join us, and I know I speak for everyone. We can say we really appreciate your talk. Just wanted to have a shout out for next month. Lee Tesfason from Iowa State University agreed to join us. We're finalizing the date, hopefully this week. So be looking for that announcement in your inboxes. Thank you everyone for coming to the webinar today. It's fabulous and enthralling for me personally as always. With that, we'll sign out.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Thank you.